Next session will be named Defense and Security for Peace. Our moderator is Mr. Yusuf Buluç, retired ambassador of Turkey. I would like to invite to the lecture, and after that, I would like to invite to the lecture panelists Mr. Selahattin Karataş, the CEO of the SAS, USA, Miss Lady Olga Maitland, President of the Defense and Security Forum, United Kingdom, Mr. Metin Gürcan, co-founder of the Episteme Turkey, Mr. Murat Loster, founder of Loster Turkey. I would like to invite to the stage. Please. Welcome. Stage is yours.
Excuse me. Hello? Is it working? As is? Okay. I'm sorry. I suppose we should start right away. We are almost racing against the clock. A very warm welcome to all. As the Master of Ceremonies has introduced me, let me repeat, I'm a retired Turkish ambassador. I'm grateful to the organizers for having invited me and the rest of my panelists to take part in this auspicious organization. I'm not very fond of afternoon sessions, simply because having had a rather satisfactory and fulfilling lunch, we, the panelists, will have to somehow be able to overtake the intellectual consumption of what we are going to deliver, as opposed to the biological digestion that should result from the having had that lunch. You need a little bit of jolting up in order not to fall asleep. Let me do this in the following way. As this group does not have a keynote speaker, I'm not going to assume the role of a keynote speaker, but as a moderator, which is a rather honorable position, which I don't think I deserve, I will say something to offer a framework to the discussion that our panelists are going to pursue. When I looked at the program and the lineup of topics and the issues that were assigned to each of those panels, I was a little bit concerned that defense and security would only take a second seat, perhaps no seat at all, as opposed to the priority and the precedence of sustainable development. But as the summit proceedings unfolded, I came to realize that this was not so. We heard from many speakers in the earlier panels that without adequate defense and a sustainable security policy, there will be no question of sustaining economic development or development in any sense, let alone protection of the nations that you're entrusted to protect. We have with us, fortunately, and I'm honored to welcome him, Professor Bobolo, who spoke at the trade wars panel that the international liberal world order was in state of jeopardy. There has been, we have seen some unraveling of the security architecture, at least since the end of the Cold War. And the most dramatic part of it is that while we accept that there will be a demise of the international security order, we don't know what is going to replace it. That is probably the most daunting aspect of what is happening. This panel is going to put further meat on what we have heard in other panels, including the one that I have just referred. In order to be able to put defense and security as an element of sustainability of development, I think I will have to refer myself to a public debate which has its historical roots. Defense and providing security for the masses is a very costly exercise. It's a very costly endeavor. So those who hold the money purse would rather look at the amount that needs to be assigned to defense with great attention and care. One school of thought would say, spending too much on defense is a hindrance to economic development. The other school of thought will tell you that if your defenses are weakened and your defense posture is eroding, you're opening up an opportunity to the rival competing powers and inviting them to impose their will and priorities on you in such a way that would be to the detriment of your own defense and security priorities, especially if I then may borrow again from Professor Bobolo, especially in a world that the leadership, the learned leadership, the intellectual polity follows the concept of a zero-sum game. So you will have to spend quite a bit of money to ensure that your defense posture is robust enough to deter, to defend in case deterrence fails. If I may borrow from a Turkish saying, which I will try to translate, cenge hazır olmak için sulh zamanında yeterli kaynakları savunma imkanlarına ayırmanız gerekiyor. That is not the real Turkish saying, but the translation of it. Last year's audience at which I took part heard from this panel under the moderation of Lady Maitland that the security situation was eroding. Dear members of the audience, we have bad news for you. The security situation has got worsened since last year for a number of reasons. Let me just say, as we have heard from the previous speakers in earlier panels, one would say, will have you believe that war is unavoidable, and others will sort of much more optimistically look at a prospect where peace is so valuable that we should do everything possible in our means to be able to preserve it. I think I can go on quite a bit more, but that would be unfair. That would leave too little a time for the rest of the speakers. We have a group of people here, colleagues. I have in my mind sort of created two compartments. We have two classicists who will deal with the conventional aspects of security and defense. And then we have two modernists, not to call them postmodernists, who will look at what we once knew as the esoteric aspects of security. That was in the past, but presently, what they are going to talk about rests in the heart of the current security concept, no longer esoteric, but real threats, as otherwise known as hybrid threats. They are cybersecurity and information security. Without further ado, let me invite Lady Maitland. I believe she belongs to that classical school of security conventions, to take the floor and share her perspective with us. Lady Maitland, it's your choice whether you want to speak there or please take the rostrum.
Ambassador, thank you very much indeed for your very interesting remarks, and one which I totally concur. Just 3 weeks ago, on November the 11th, we had Armistice Day, and that was to mark the ending of the First World War. And overall, on all sides, nearly 10 million young men died. 67 million fought in that war. Many of them fought and died here in Gallipoli. It was overall a sordid hellscape. But what I have to ask ourselves is, what have we learnt from that terrible experience? Just before Armistice Day, I had a very moving meeting with a former Russian foreign minister, Igor Ivanov. And his message to me was very simple. He said, to avoid misunderstanding and appalling, calamitous decision-making, there has to be a point of contact, human contact at the highest possible level. And he stressed his point by saying, you know what? Even in the darkest days of the Soviet Union, during the days of the Bays of Pigs invasion, there was always a mechanism by which leaders could talk to each other. Foreign ministers could telephone each other. The military spoke to each other. And then he said, but tragically, all that is over. The doors are closed. And the Russians can no longer seek a meeting with the UK Foreign Secretary. At best, it would be a mid-level minister. And when I put this question to a very senior British ambassador, why? And he said, well, what is there to discuss? We know the facts. And he was referring to the Novichok poisoning in Salisbury. But you know what? Add to that the fact that the Russian Council with NATO has been closed down after decades of existence. What kind of cooperation can there possibly be? And now, of all times, when we're looking at the headlines almost by the hour of the incident of the 3 Ukrainian ships which have been held by the Russians, isn't it now more important than ever there should be some kind of communication? So, we have had statements from the NATO, we've had statements from the European Union, but what kind of private contact is there and established and can really work? And I feel, in a sense, we have actually got to look more deeply as to what kind of society has our world evolved. Where do we get our leadership from in this? So, for instance, when we look at the White House, well, they seem to blow hot and cold about Trump, between Trump and Putin. One moment, they're meeting in private, and it all went well. Next moment, the idea is that Mr. Putin would be invited to America, and the idea went dead. Now, in fact, they may have a chance of meeting next week at the G20. But the question is this: what we're really seeing is not just the prevarication and all that, but the US itself is distancing itself. And the whole idea of Make America Great is being done at terms of really harming global relationships. Disruptive politics seems to be in the norm. And I think this is really where I have a real concern. So we see how this impacts on the UK. And some stick to the concept that we've had and do have a very special relationship with the United States. Well, at lower levels, perhaps, but not in the White House. And you know what? I find it very unsettling that even today, President Trump has been reported of criticizing Theresa May's stance on Brexit and siding with her opponents, the critics. One, it's none of his business. Two, to say there'll be no trade deal is an absolute nonsense. Three, he's trying to bully the British. And I think in a sense we have moved into a very new and risky era. And in fact, this was compounding an earlier phone call that he made to Theresa May when, out of the goodness of her heart, she called him out to congratulate him on the midterm elections. And what happened? He yelled down the phone with her for 10 minutes about the criticisms on Brexit, the NATO spending, and indeed our standing on Iran. The Prime Minister was left absolutely stunned. And this is meant to be with our friends. So where are we? And indeed, it has to be said, the UK is not alone in these insults. Macron, having tried very hard to give Trump a warm visit to France, has also been rebuffed. Turkey has its struggles. China hardly knows where to turn. The US sees China now as an economic and military threat to be challenged and seen off. Until now, they had been successful trading partners, and you could argue who has the upper hand. It depends what figures you look at. But really, at the end of the day, it's not just a rouse on every possible subject. If there is not proper, courteous, and regular contact at the very highest level, there can be dreadful miscalculations. And in my view, Igor Ivanov had a point. Now, of course, Ivanov himself is on slightly weak territory because, as we heard very movingly in an earlier session, when the former president of Ukraine spoke, he talked about the 6 wars which have been, conflicts have been taking part on the far eastern edge of Europe. And in each case, they've been instigated by the Kremlin. And he says, well, what kind of contact is there? And indeed, dialogue has undoubtedly gone. And I think also we have to face the fact, as indeed, and I know that Professor Lowe has been mentioned already once, and I'm going to mention him twice because I thought his speech yesterday was so timely. And not only is the geopolitical map changing, but there's also the attitude. And as Professor Lowe said yesterday, it's a question of, I can, I will use my power, I challenge anybody to oppose me. And I think this kind of attitude is a new world that we have to live in. And we have to be very, very careful indeed about how we handle this. Last month, General Sir James Everard, who's the Deputy Sir Kerr, addressed my organization with some very thoughtful remarks. And he noted the growing nationalism in Europe, which has been constantly referred to in this conference, and the fact that that, plus the rising migration issues, has given a consequent rise of instability. Now, the thing is this. Macron got it right, I think. He said patriotism is something to be proud of, to have a sense of pride and responsibility in your country. But when you verge to intolerance and nationalism, then there are some very real dangers. And we're seeing it not only all over Europe, but we're seeing it all over the world. Look at the Middle East and how the tone has been changed by Saudi Arabia. I remember when I first got to know the Gulf, way back in the early 1990s, after the first Gulf War, they were brothers. Their families were intermarried with each other. The idea they should be now in such enmity was beyond imagination. They were talking about a common currency. And now all those family ties, all that unity has gone. And then we look at another way. We look at the way United States is pushing for ever more sanctions on Iran. So what possible good would that do? It would only harden their determination to resist, and more likely and very dangerously, to push them to resume their nuclear program. So why withdraw one-sidedly from an agreement? And what possible consultations did there take place anyway? None with either Iran or indeed with the US allies. Europe was aghast. Even the UK, who have normally been so loyal to America, have been reluctant to, they took a stand supporting the European Union and, of course, condemned that decision that the Americans took. But why indeed did America withdraw one-sidedly from the INF Treaty without a word of warning or consultation with our allies? Was the phone ever picked up to discuss the INF concerns of NATO? It would have been more helpful, in my view, if officials were instructed to resolve compliance concerns and to use the occasion to energize discussions on the simmering conflict in Donbass and the restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty, as called for by the Minsk agreements. And my goodness, right now, with all the issues with the taking of Ukrainian tanks, never has been a more important time. Summits do help, as we've seen some major initiatives as in North Korea. But what I feel is, by all means, NATO and Russia should have their major military exercises. I see it as healthy to send a message of resilience, preparedness, and deterrence. But that doesn't mean a shutdown on diplomacy. So where does it all lead? In my view, dialogue is plain common sense. And it's not a case of giving ground, but finding common ground. We're moving into a dark age of intolerance, intimidation, and bullying. And it's not just military might which causes risks, but as indeed, as Ambassador mentioned just now, trade wars and cyber wars add their own dangers. And with Turkey, as an important NATO country protecting the eastern flank, I would like to say this. NATO should select carefully the battles it wants to fight, protect its own interests and borders, most definitely yes. Admittedly, international terrorism has brought a new equation and a need for cooperation. And undoubtedly, very unpleasant people with totally different values have to be dealt with. Territorially, I am against out-of-area military intervention. It's tempting. Something must be done. It's very upsetting. It's very distressing to see on television distressed people. But attempting regime change should be firmly ruled out, and even with a leader as brutal and heartily hated as Saddam Hussein, I think it was a great mistake. And we've learned our lessons from both Iraq and indeed from Libya. Only massive instability was resulted. Now, what was quite interesting, last week I was in Algeria. Algeria suffered a dreadful civil war in the 1990s. 6 million people went into exile. 250,000 people died. And the Algerians said, when I first went out there in 2005, we were abandoned. Nobody came to our rescue. When I posed the question last week, I said, well, how do you feel now? Intervention in Syria has not solved their problems. When you've got Iran, you've got Russia, you've got the Americans, you've got the British adding for their pennyworth. Did it help? And I think the message I got from Algeria is actually, on reflection, it was best we were left alone and we came to our own solution. Sometimes people can over-intervene. So what I just feel, in sharing dialogue, it's not a matter of surrender, it's not appeasement, or even giving into a position. What I do feel very keenly, which has been expressed in this conference and other forums here, trade and cultural exchange are important. Keeping all the lines of communication are vital. But I would like to see a more united NATO, a trust in all our partners, today with disruptive diplomacy that is hard going. But what Europe can do is to be vigilant and humble enough to lift that phone, hold tight to humanity, and remember the past, and be grateful that today the continent is broadly in harmony. And when in doubt, I would say, lift up that phone, make that call, and fly. Thank you.
I would like to thank Lady Maitland for her presentation and congratulate her for the way in which she delivered her beliefs and convictions with emphasis on a number of issues that are dear to my heart, I'm sure to the hearts of the rest of co-panelists. The questions of lack of communication, the problems of weak leadership, the inability of creating room for the other players to do some strategic maneuvering. And she also focused on the humanitarian aspect of such deficiencies. I particularly took note of the several points she made vis-à-vis the current American leadership and the way in which United States exercises its political and military power. It's not for me to speak on behalf of the United States or in defense of President Trump. They will have to speak for themselves. But let us, with some benefit of the doubt, let us somehow assign to them, as we assign to other world leaders, that this leader has been democratically elected, and what decisions he takes, I would like to believe, are taken in the best interest of the United States. The problem is that these decisions are taken unilaterally without due regard to what the rest of their allies are thinking, as in the case of the INF, you have kindly mentioned. And I think this results in a situation where several efforts are being made. If I may return to my earlier remarks, several efforts have been made to safeguard the world liberal order, but those efforts are quite haphazard. They are not mutually supportive, they are not mutually reinforcing, which results in squandering of opportunities and squandering of resources. I think that is the most saddest part of it. With that, let me turn to another classicist. As distinct and opposed to Lady Maitland's hardcore realistic presentation, Mr. Gürcan is going to give us some conceptual thoughts to sort of alleviate the concerns of in our minds as raised by Lady Maitland, because I believe what she tells us is if we are not careful enough, we are going to get ourselves into big, big trouble. Please, Metin Bey, if you could want to take the floor wherever, there, here.
Okay. Thank you for the organizers to invite me to this extremely important occasion. And thank you for all. It's my honor to speak in front of such a distinguished audience. So, I served in Turkish Special Forces for 10 years, and then I also served in Turkey, Southeast, Iraq, Kosovo, Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, multiple times in Afghanistan. The very topic that I'm gonna talk today will not be about my field experience, but it will be a sort of very interesting one, a sort of conceptual one. Based on or relying on my field experience and also the things that I studied in my academic works. So as you may guess from this title, my talk will be a problem-setting one rather than a problem-solving one. What I want to do is to critically engage in the conceptual debate about security and insecurity, and we'll be asking some provoking questions about security provision in the age of fluidity, and about the changing characteristics of armed conflict, particularly in state versus violent non-state actor confrontations. This is the main theme of my area of scholarly research. I'm trying to understand dynamics, diminishing or fading, and the very nature and the characteristics of state versus violent non-state actor confrontations. So in this sense, my talk will be a sort of little bit philosophical one, seeking to problematize traditional conceptions about security and peace, and with a specific focus on armed clashes in Syria. As I said before, as an ex-soldier scholar, I really try to understand the very nature and the characteristics of armed conflict in Syria, because I would argue that after the Syria experience, we should revise our existing conceptions about nature and characteristics of armed conflict. I also suggest that the post-ISIS Syria is still an extremely fragile security environment. So after seeing that Syria has gradually become a feral state, particularly with the rise of ISIS in 2014, I coined the term fluid security and insecurity environment, emphasizing the need for thinking about the security in a wider and deeper fashion. Security as a concept in our region has widened to an extent that even domains such as information technologies, cyber domain, traveling, transportation, money transfers, criminal issues like transnational smuggling, organized crime, human trafficking and refugee crisis, pandemics, mass migrations, and natural disasters like droughts and earthquakes are defined within the concept of security. And to a certain extent, all these concepts, all these fields are militarized. And security has also deepened in a sense that traditional state-centric understanding has got blurred, and we are now talking about human and global security as well. Interesting to note that these three definitions, I mean state-centric, human-centric, and global-centric definitions of security has been creating deep cleavages when providing security. In almost all security environments, finding a golden balance between or harmony among all these three domains, state security or national security, human security and global security, it is getting harder and harder with every passing day. For instance, if you prioritize national security, then you may easily miss the human and environmental side of the story, and vice versa. For me, in contemporary conflicts like the one that we witness in and around Idlib, and in and around Raqqa or Afrin in Syria, at the moment the foreign and Syrian security providers have been experiencing this paradox. I mean the question of how to reach a golden balance among national, human, and environmental security and sustainably maintain it. As a military officer, as I said before, I will suggest that I'm very sure that the security providers in those hot zones, they cannot separate what is military from what is non-military, what is local from what is national, what is regional from what is global, and what is political from what is economic and socio-cultural, and cognitive, what is cognitive from what is emotive. So we are talking about highly complex and hybrid security settings. So the question that I think the questions on the slide, they are very important when you try to conceptualize the very concept of security. And then these are the questions that are getting extremely difficult nowadays. And then if you are dealing with complex settings like the one in Syria. So what is security? And then whose security are we talking about? What counts as a security issue, and who decides what's a security issue or not? How can security be achieved? Can absolute security be achieved? And how much security is enough? How much security is enough? Question directly reflecting the debate about security versus freedom. And then is security a status quo-oriented concept or a revisionist one? So these are very important questions. And then in the era of hyper-connectedness and extreme fluidity, both in material and cognitive terms, security should be analyzed as a set of objectives, tools, strategies, and attitudes across spatial and temporal and imagined borders at the micro-local level, this village or that neighborhood, to local, city-centric level, national, regional, global levels of analysis. But the new conceptions of security should be analyzed through the lenses of mobilities, starting from human security, I think, to the national level, then to the global level, in order to take into account the aspirations and needs of mobile populations, the need for state actors and their national securities, and then for the good of the globe. So I should also emphasize that diverse experiences of mobility and multiple vulnerabilities experienced by individuals that intersect with and sometimes challenge national security domains. For instance, mobility patterns of individuals and ideas that are diversifying at a rate far outstripping the capacity of states to adapt to promote the idea that mobile or empowerment or ideologically strong individuals can generate their own security when they have an agency and ability to plan a territory or an ungoverned space out of the control of the state and money to finance, and the most importantly, when they find a violent ideology to rally around. So more important, as we have seen in the case of ISIS, they can wage war. Right now, we are living in a crazy world in which people can wage war against a state actor or against a group of state actors when an individual can find a territory, money to finance its cause, and then a sort of ideological cause to make people rally around. And then the question of how to peacefully resolve state versus violent non-state actor confrontation is still far from being answered. So after this conceptual opening, let me briefly illustrate in what sense the armed clashes in Syria have affected our understanding of war, armed conflict, and violence. So the traditional definition of warfare or armed conflict is in Clausewitzian term, war as the continuation of politics by other means. So war is seen as a means for the service of political gain. But this is the classical thinking. This classical thinking, waging war, for political end states is not relevant anymore, I think. So in the real new settings, like the one in Syria, what is the primary objective of making war? To reach a desired political end state and to impose one's political will over the enemy? Is this still relevant objective? But if you look at the war in Syria, particularly with the rise of ISIS, what we have noticed is a shift from political understanding of armed conflict to what I call eschatological one. Esca, Latin prefix, esca is a Latin prefix, implying future and end states, final destiny and final events. So it also includes one's ancestors, collective memory, and his emotional attachment to a territory, and then the ethnic or sectarian identity. So if an armed conflict becomes an eschatological one rather than a political one, then it turns into a war among clashing myths, historical narratives, and future visions and end states. It's not just about political objectives at the present, but it's a war covering the past, present, and the future. So it's become much more complex and complicated. So in eschatological understanding of warfare, what we see is the expansion of war fighting in the past, present, and to the future. So what we see, I think, in Syria, particularly in the north of Syria, is a sort of transition of political understanding of warfare to then eschatological one. So here is the example of two texts, for instance. These are two texts from Abu Bakr Nejri. He's the guy, the ideological father of ISIS ideology, and then the text Management of Savagery, the ideological Bible of ISIS penned in 2006 in Iraq. And then also, if you look at Breivik's manifesto of 2083, the Breivik guy, who killed almost 80 innocent people. So if you look at these two texts, they are good examples of eschatological texts. So when you take ideology, for instance, out of this side, you can easily see the interesting similarity between these two texts. So for me, that Nejri guy and Breivik, I mean, it's impossible for these two guys to make them sit on the negotiation table and to start a political negotiation. So they are the ones, you know, experiencing this eschatological side of the story. And then here is my suggestion. When you look at the dynamics feeding conflict in north of Syria, what we see is a sort of eschatological zero-sum game between three types of armed motivation. Three types of motivation causing armed mobilization. First one is Sunni Salafi, jihadi one. The second one is Kurdish ethno-nationalist one. And the third one is Pan-Shia and pro-Iranian armed mobilization. And the very nature of the fight among these three is eschatological zero-sum game. For instance, why am I saying zero-sum game? The capture of Raqqa by US-backed YPG forces from ISIS. Think about that. For me, it's -1 for ISIS, +1 for YPG. At the end of the day, we have 0. Think about the capture of Afrin, city center. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, it's -1 for Kurdish ethno-nationalist eschatological understanding. It's +1 for, you know, to some extent Salafi jihadi understanding. At the end of the day, we have zero-sum game. What we have at hand is, I think the problem at hand is, we don't have a sort of institutional mechanism, first to diminish and then to eliminate this eschatological game between these three types of motivation causing armed mobilization in a sort of synchronized and simultaneous fashion. So what we call is proxy war. You know, we are using those local actors having these motivations as proxies, but at the end of the day, since we do not attempt to disrupt this zero-sum game between these three, we are getting, you know, this conflict much more eschatological one. So the ethnic and sectarian identities, ancestors, past myths, narratives, and future visions are coming to the stage, making the war much more complicated. So another important point, you know, I want you to think about or reflect upon is what is the opposite of war? Surely it was peace in the past, but I think Syria experience shows that peace is not opposite of war anymore. So it might be non-war, for instance. I use non-war as the opposite of war because, particular Afghanistan experience shows us that, the military victory, and then they do not directly or automatically lead to sustainable peace. So it's not possible for us to use these two concepts as antonyms, peace or war, because achieving peace is a different story when you think about achieving war, or trying to reach a military victory. So operational military victories do not automatically mean peace anymore. And sometimes in some particular complex settings like the one in Afghanistan and in Syria, very attempt of winning wars, moving us away from achieving peace. So, okay. I also think that we need to problematize use of military power in those complex hybrid settings like the one that we witness in Syria. Syria shows that we should be critical about character, representation, application, and effects of military power. How can we decide on this? And this is a very important question, despite the fact that I have a military background, and then, I served in Turkish Special Forces, I said before, several, maybe 1.5 decades. I see that my field experience makes me ask this question when I see those local settings: how much military is enough? And then this is an important question. If you use military blindfoldedly, and that creates a sort of strategic blindness. So if you use militaries as hammers, when you use them, everything starts to look like a nail, every problem. So if you militarize a problem, then it's not so easy for you to resolve those problems. So in those environments, I think we need more to understand how military power operates and how it has come to work in the way it does and what its limits might be. So I think to modern militaries, they need for more designers and disruptive thinkers, and this is another thing that I can say. And then I think that will be the end of my presentation. Thank you all for listening to me.
I also thank Mr. Gürcan. I cannot pronounce myself on what we have heard from him until I get to read the hard copy of what he said. But probably I'd rather refer myself to his PhD thesis. I'm sure that we have heard some excerpts and highlights from the thesis in an updated version, I'm sure. But I think, the conceptual aspect of security should not be relegated to some second-class thing, because lack of understanding of the concepts of security and defense, I think those political masters and the holders of the purse will unlikely to achieve what is adequate for a defense of certain society, and how that level of adequacy is perceived by the competing rival powers. That's critical. With that, let me now turn to the next panelist, who will sort of bring us more to the current issues of daily security. I would like to invite Mr. Karataş, CEO of SASPAS, United States, who will talk, as I believe, about cybersecurity issues mainly, but as you will see, the compartmentalization which I offered in my introductory remarks would hold true. Him and the next speaker will talk about the contemporary issues of security, which are no less important than the conventional aspects of it. Please, Mr. Karataş, if you would take the floor either from where you're seated or at the lectern.
So the history of warfare has been a battle between armoring and weaponry, and the same thing has actually happened in the digital world. So the need for armoring in the digital world did not really become a necessity till the late 80s. And then afterwards, just like in the real world, it started to mimic it. So historically, to armor ourselves, we would put up a castle and then, if necessary, build a moat around it. And we started doing the same thing in the digital world. We started having firewalls. In fact, we use a lot of the same analogies and metaphors as was used in the real world. So we started building castles and moats, things like firewalls, and then antivirus to weed out the Trojan horses from within the castle. And that was enough for most of the 90s. What happened afterwards is that this attack surface area grew exponentially. So we went from having over 20 million computers with internet connection to having over 3 billion plus what we call endpoint devices, but they're just, in essence, digital devices that we as humans use. And then we had an exponential increase on computing that were used anywhere from electricity generation units to industrial factories to logistics systems across the whole to airport control systems. So what happened is I could now attack countries without launching a single missile, just by weaponizing exploits out there in the wild and attacking a electric power plant. Or I could attack what are called SCADA systems. In essence, it's a fancy term for the control systems that are used for, say, oil pipelines, and you can weaponize that, and you can affect tremendous economic damage on countries without launching a single missile. The problem with a lot of digital attacking is that it's almost impossible to prove both attribution and provenance. And what that means is you actually really don't know who really did it, and it's very easy to fake it. So I could show it as, say, the Chinese doing it, when in fact it could be a kid it's probably not a kid in a basement somewhere in Romania, but it could be a kid in a basement somewhere as well. So those two things are incredibly hard to do. So then what's your solution? So historically, the way we solved problems was, if you attack me, you know that I will probably try to attack you back. Well, that's not really the case in the digital world. It's almost impossible to prove both provenance and attribution. So the solution there is you have to invest in defense. So in this case, armoring defense is your best offense. So this requires a rewiring of your approach to create security for countries. So historically, we had what was called MAD, mutually assured destruction, when it came to the nuclear powers. Every time there was, the United States invested in more nuclear weaponry, so did Russia. Then when Russia raised the ante the next time, so did the United States, and vice versa. And then what happened in the 80s was Reagan said, okay, let's have the SALT talks, the strategic arms limitations talks, and both parties came together, and then they started to reduce the number of warheads. Although right now President Trump has removed those restrictions from nuclear weaponry. But we can't have the same thing in the digital world. So the real solution there is to invest in defense. So you have this massively expanded surface area, yet there are ways of solving a lot of those, or mitigating against a lot of those attack vectors. But it's not going to happen just by companies doing it out of their own goodwill. A lot of it will have to be mandated. It'll have to be part of the regulatory regime, and that will have to be a part of a national approach or a multinational approach to solving this problem. So the other thing is, I'm now talking about state-level actors. Then there's, to paraphrase the Clausewitz reference, and this is especially relevant when it comes to digital fraud, is hacking is commerce by other means. So there's also another group of actors out there who have different incentives, who can still attack important infrastructure, and it could just be a bunch of bad guys. So it's not necessarily always to hold a country hostage, but they do. Sometimes they can blackmail you, or they can attack hospitals, and they do what's called ransomware. So the type of actors out there are not necessarily countries where you have lines of communication with. It could be just the equivalent of your Somali pirate, and that's what some of these hackers are. They're the equivalent of your Somali pirates, just like you have no one to address to. It could be just a bunch of online gangs. They could be distributed. In fact, there's hacking as a service out there, and it's quite efficiently run. They have their own ecosystem. They know how to pay off each other, so a lot of your AML laws are not even applicable over there, what's called anti-money laundering laws. They send money to each other through different forms of crypto coins, but even that's not that necessary. You can still have the old-fashioned ATM withdrawals through different types of hacks. I'd love to talk more. If we have some time afterwards, please feel free to ask questions. But we're running out of time, and we don't want to be the guys forcing everyone to be late for the next session. So let me pass it on to our ambassador.
How kind of you to do this. It's very generous of you, actually, to have done it. But I think you are posing a very serious question to defense planners and security strategists. I mean, do you want to invest in main battle tanks, or you want to create firewalls that will preserve your society from the type of attacks that you have just described? I think this posits a very serious dichotomy or a dilemma for those who will have to prioritize defense spending. I think this presentation could be very coherently followed by our next panelist, who will, as I believe, talk to us about information security, Murat Lostar. Murat is the founder of a company in Turkey who's also called by his own name, Lostar. I think he is an engineer who specializes in information security. Murat Bey, would you please take it from there
Yes.
and tell us
Thank
what-
you. Let me also be as brief as possible.
You're kind, thank you.
Thank you. Well, as said by Mr. Karatkash, basically what we have experienced is in the early ages of technology, what we were only doing is virtualization. We had some physical means of doing things, and we basically take it to virtual. We had money, we now have virtual money. We had, well, even brain, now we have the virtual brain. But now, if you look to the other side, for the last 5 to 10 years, now we are going to a reverse order. Now we have actually cyber-physical systems. That is, we are taking something virtual and let it affect or interact with the physical. Such as a very basic ones would be 3D printers. You dream of something on digital and you have it on physical ones. And also Internet of Things devices or endpoints, as Mr. Karatas said, that you can very easily use your mobile device to operate your heater or air conditioning at your home. But once they are hacked, it can be used and be very cold and very warm and very cold and very warm for all night long, and in the morning you can wake up as sick. So in terms of security, I mean cybersecurity, in the old days we had three mains. The basic one would be mainly confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and then we have the...
So sorry. Dear guests, our Minister of Agriculture and Forestry, Mr. Bekir Pakdemirli, came to our room, and our Minister of Agriculture and Food and Forestry, Mr. Rumen Porodzanov, came to our room. Değerli konuklarımız, Türkiye Cumhuriyeti Tarım Bakanımız Sayın Bekir Pakdemirli ve Bulgaristan Tarım Bakanımız Sayın Rumen Porodzanov salonumuza teşrif ettiler. Evet, bir sonraki panelimize geçmek için sizlerden müsaade istiyoruz.
Biz panelistler de Sayın Bakan'ın bu oturumdaki mevcudiyetinden ötürü şeref duyuyoruz. Kendisine hoş geldin diyoruz. Varlığını salondaki yeni katılımcılardan da fark ediyoruz. Fakat Sayın Bakan'ın müsaadesiyle son konuşmacı arkadaşımız bize bilgi güvenliği konusunda bilgi veriyordu. Onun konuşmasının bitmesini bekleyelim. Teşekkür ederim.
Well, as we look into the cybersecurity side, I mean, we understand now that after the armies and Navy and Air Force, now we have the cyber forces. But the real problem is when you have the military exercises in Army, Navy, and Air Force, maybe you have some drills that would work for it. But for really the cyber, it is not really possible to have drills with the old approach, which is the red and blue forces attacking each other and trying to defend on the other side. So maybe this is one of the reasons why we see all those cyber forces, and they are sometimes irrelevantly attacking each other in terms of defending or sometimes actually behaving as somebody else, posturing as somebody else, and try to attack some other people. Well, I guess that would be it. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for curtailing it to such an extent. I think, thank you very much for attending to this panel. As I said earlier, we are honored with the presence of Mr. Minister. We will have to conclude our proceedings at this point. And I thank the panelists, all of them, for their contributions. And we should look forward to next year's summit to replicate and update what we have discussed today. Thank you very much.